Okay, then we'll get started. I'm going to start with a short video. There might be a bit of a delay in the end, depending on the speed of your connection. So when we get to the end, I'll just hold on for a few seconds so that your screens catch up with me. Okay.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today and welcome. I thought that given that we were going to be talking about being creative whilst coaching today, I should get a little bit creative myself and I'd film a short video for you to introduce us to this topic. And if I'm being completely honest, it was a great excuse to get away from my desk today and come out here and enjoy this amazing sunshine in this fantastic woodland. So my aim is to cover two main themes in this discussion about how we structure and deliver coaching for our clients. So the first one of those concerns the places where we choose to conduct our coaching sessions and how much thought genuinely goes into the places where we coach in service of our clients. And for today, I'm particularly going to focus on my specific area of expertise, and that's walking and coaching in outdoor settings, and the particular benefits that that can bring to enable both focus, attention, and creativity to genuinely develop within the coaching relationship. And the second theme that I want to explore today is how we could possibly extend the duration of a single coaching session to way beyond the typical 90 minutes that we might have experienced before, in a way that then allows our clients to explore a complex problem that they've been trying to resolve, but in a way that enables them to look at all the different avenues and explore them more deeply, draw out the themes, make the connections, and reflect. So first off, let me invite you to reflect on where your current coaching sessions take place. Go on, have a think. Close your eyes maybe. Picture in your mind's eye where you do most of your coaching. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And how well does it actually work for you as the coach? And perhaps more importantly, how well does it work for your client? Okay, so having done that, now think about where they could take place. If you truly gave yourself the permission to be more creative about the places in which you coach. For me, walking coaching gives me a whole new world of possibilities that allows my clients to get a fresh perspective on the challenges that they wish were more resolved than they are now. So let's keep walking and let's explore some of the other possibilities of places where you could coach if you chose to be a bit more creative and get outside into a natural environment.
Okay, folks, that was slightly weird watching myself talk about, and maybe a tad narcissistic, but we thought we'd be a little bit different in the way we kicked off the webinar today. And I suppose I should explore this title, which I imagine sort of was the hook for most of you, about coaching myths exposed. What does that actually mean? And I guess for me, the other way of looking at it is what might be some of the self-limiting beliefs that we hold as coaches, and specifically for today around the places where coaching takes place or has to take place, and how long it should last. And I guess those for me are the two areas that I want to sort of explore. And I guess we're looking at, by terms of myth, what I'm talking about is exploring this idea of the standard model of coaching. So I'm not necessarily on about the models or tools that you use in the content of a coaching session, but more about how a coaching relationship's structured. So by that standard model, what I'm talking about is, over the last sort of 15, 20 years, as coaching has developed as an external, for external providers providing into the, the corporate space, is typically, and this is my own experience and what's reported back to me from our clients, is, typical coaching relationships are, 6 sessions. They go out to the marketplace, they say, we want some coaching, and what they get offered is, well, it's 6 sessions. They're probably 4 to 6 weeks apart, and they probably last, an hour to 90 minutes. And I suppose what I want to really explore today is that standard model has existed for a long time and clearly works. So don't get me wrong. I'm not, knocking this model as something that doesn't work. For all of that time, that model's worked and works well for lots and lots of people. However, it doesn't always work for everybody. And there are lots of scenarios that, increasingly we're being positioned to us from our clients are, yeah, they've had that in the past. That's not going to work again. They can't spare they don't want it to last that long. They need the answers, to the problems they've got now. Can you do it differently? And that's for us how this topic has come about. And so those are the things that I want to sort of really explore today is, as coaches, as providers of coaching, as buyers of coaching, does that standard model hold water in every case? And, if we allowed ourselves to think more creatively, what are the other ways we could do it? And so the two things I'm going to focus on specifically today, and there are lots of other things that we could explore, and we'll probably return to those in subsequent webinars. But the two things for today specifically are, where could we coach? Coaching typically in that standard model will take place in a meeting room, in the office of the person, or in a public a meeting room in the office environment, or maybe somewhere very locally. But typically that's what it is. And secondly, how long could we make it last? Okay, so again, that typical standard model has always been around the sort of hour, 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours mark. But if someone needed or wanted much more time than that, how could we push that? How could we make that work so that it was both possible for the coach to do and it worked for the coachee, that they got that extended period of time to explore the issue that they wanted? So I'll start off by this picture. So this picture was taken at the end of last year as part of the research that I'm doing into the challenging the status quo around duration and environment. And looking at intensive, and by intensive I mean longer coaching sessions whilst walking in natural environments. And I guess for me, this photo represents the sort of the pinnacle of my current coaching practice. And for me, this was probably the best coaching session in terms of my experience of it, my ability, and the experience of the coachee that I've ever had. And it probably started 20 years before that. Prior to being in the corporate world, I spent a lot of time working in the outdoor environment as an instructor, as a teacher, running overseas expeditions, predominantly with young people. But in all of those experiences, lots of walking and lots of opportunities to see how people were developing. And so that's what I want to explore today. So this is where the story started. So about in 2011, I started my master's at Henley Business School, and it was a fantastic experience, great personal development. And at the end of it, as is always the case, I had to do a thesis. And the text on the right is the title of my my research. So looking specifically at where coaching happens and how it influences on specifically the coach's attention and focus. And what interested me, the reason why this topic came about was that over the whole of those 3 years, what really surprised me that no one was talking about where you coach and how it influences on the quality of your ability to coach and therefore the experience of the coachee. And when I then went out into the coaching literature to try and read more about it, what surprised me even more was there was very little written about it there either. And so that's what then led me to look at it in more detail by my own research as part of my master's. It was rather broad research because there was nothing written about it, and so the research that I've done in the last 12 months has honed in, and I'm going to come on to that later in the webinar. So I sort of mentioned that I went out into the literature to look, and it was interesting to see in the current coaching literature there wasn't anything. But interestingly, I found this quote that I'm going to show you now, which was a social commentator back at the start of the last century, back over 100 years ago. A guy called George Trevelyan, who was he did an essay about walking, and I just want to let you read this this quote because I think for me it captures exactly where I've got to now in my own research and the evidence that I'm finding from other fields of science and psychology at the moment. So have a read of this quote. So I think that's really interesting that someone, over 100 years ago was writing about the link between, our physiology and activity and how that impacts on our sort of mental and emotional well-being. And sort of, yeah, obviously had no science necessary to back that up if you read his essay. Um, but if you sort of fast forward 100 years or so, there's so much evidence now from environmental psychology and eco psychology, the world of sort of mindfulness and mindfulness-based stress reduction, and from neuroscience as well, that sort of backs up this gut feeling and this heartfelt thing that actually being in a natural environment and walking can have such a positive impact on people's mental well-being and ability to think more clearly. So that's what sort of kicked me off on this research. So the next slide I'm going to show you now, and I'm not going to share all the detail with you. These are some of the outputs from that initial bit of research I did in my master's. And just without going into the detail, what I did was some structured interviews with coaches, and these are the themes. So having transcribed all of those interviews, these were some of the themes that came out of it. And there's a whole lot here on the left-hand side that talks about the psychological influence of the space in which you coach on the coach. And also, what I want to focus in on are these three here, about how the venue itself became a specific theme in the conversation, the influence on the coaching. So one is the value given to nature, the venue playing a specific role, either positive or negative, in the coaching encounter, and then finally, and this is the bit that I've then taken further, is walking as a specific tool that you can use within coaching. So if I just give you a little bit more detail to some of the results that came out of those interviews in that early piece of research. I'll let you take some of that in quickly before I talk over it. So the two things here then, so one about the value given to natural environments. And interestingly, although there were these 18 themes that came out of those interviews, they were very, very few and far between in terms of the experience of the coach. So most coaches were only sort of pulling out one or two experiences of sessions where they'd actually done that. But interestingly, we're then reflecting on, oh, it works so well, why haven't I done that again since? So some of the things like, the impact of the natural environment itself on the mental well-being, both for them as the coach, being able to focus and be attentive to their coachee, but also about the way it enabled the coachee to be less stuck. I'm interested. So I noticed Bernadette's made a comment here about doing some coaching sessions, sitting looking outside over landscapes, and how it felt fantastic way to help people get unstuck, and that's exactly what came out of this research as well. And also then this bottom one then around attention restoration. Some of you may have come across this before, but this is research done from a guy called Stephen Kaplan and his wife Rachel, looking at the two main types of attention that we have. Directed attention, which is the really focused sort of attention we use in the workplace, focusing in on complex meetings or spreadsheets or complex project planning, that sort of thing, which takes lots and lots of cognitive energy. As opposed to in natural environments, what we have is involuntary attention. And that's the attention that evolved for us to be able to identify potential threats to us in the environment. So, if you're walking in a woodland that's all really nice and peaceful and quiet, and suddenly a squirrel shoots up a tree, that will take 100% of your attention for a fleeting moment. It will assess that it's not a threat, and then you'll get all that attention back again. So the point being made is that in an outdoor environment, it allows you a totally different type of attention that encourages creativity, a greater breadth and depth of thinking, and has a much more sort of restorative property that allows the coaching to develop better. So those are the two of the main things. But then the thing that came out the most, which was unexpected at the time, was this final one, which was walking as a specific coaching tool to use. Now, the interesting thing here is that although there were 16 themes that came out, and I'll sort of let you sort of take some of those in, the interesting thing was that nearly every coach that took part in this research, most of their evidence was from their own experience of walking and having conversations with their peers, as opposed to using it proactively with a coachee. And again, all of them thinking, yeah, actually, I do some of my best thinking when I'm walking. Why don't I use that when I'm coaching? So there were some great things that came out about, and the interesting one at the top for me is this idea of it being a much more somatic and holistic experience. So, people spend so much time in their head in that directed attention space when they're in work that actually, if you can get them mobile and walking, it's a much, somatic, meaning more embodied. So you get people to sort of, they experience coaching rather than thinking about being coached. And that's really allows that creativity and breadth of thinking to flourish in that coaching encounter. It's also the fact that it becomes a physical exercise as well, and not just intellectual. So again, there's some fantastic research from neuroscience now that says that some of the sort of optimal you've probably heard from sport about VO2 max, which is the volume of oxygen that you have that goes around your bloodstream. And there's been some really interesting research, several bits, but more or less coming out with the same evidence that we need to be about 65% of our VO2 max, as it needs to be quite active to get the best cognitive processing levels. So if you then think about when we're sitting down, we're nowhere near that level. We're probably way below sort of 30-25%. So actually that physical process of walking and exerting raises that VO2 max level, which creates that better cognitive processing in the brain, which combined with that involuntary attention, you can see how that allows people to think much more clearly about the problems that they've been stuck with. There were clearly some things there towards the bottom there where you can see there were some barriers to it. So people have mentioned about not having eye contact when you're walking might seem a barrier to the coaching relationship. And whilst that was the experience of that particular coach, I'm going to come back to that later on in terms of the experience I've had more recently in the last 12 months as I've pushed this research on a bit further. So this was the sort of genesis really of this idea of saying, okay, clearly there's something in this, and this standard model works, but maybe it doesn't work all the time. Oh, sorry, they suddenly jumped around all the. I'm touching the mouse there. So I've put this this is those of you who aren't old enough. This is a picture of a car called a Morris Ital, and the reason why I've used this today is that if we're looking about this standard model of coaching that's existed for so long, when do they start to go out of date? And I heard this on the radio this morning. So the Morris Ital was built between 1981 and 1984, and they must have built hundreds of thousands of them. Interestingly, someone had done some look today. As of today, there are only 46 of them still registered on the roads in the UK. And it just sort of seemed to be a good analogy as to where we are and how this sort of thought process for me has come about, because the catalyst for me to look at this was the frustration of our clients that we were talking to not being able to go out to the market and buy the sort of external coaching that they wanted for their people. Aware that the standard model worked for lots of people, but where they needed something different, it was no longer ticking all the boxes. So typically that was things where, I've got a senior leader who's making a major career transition within the business and, needs to think it all through and is struggling with it. They don't want to sign up to 6 months because they want to resolve it yesterday, not in 6 months' time. Or, someone's just taken on this massive project and again, they're struggling to resolve how they're going to take it forward. So it was people with big significant issues who, they'd had personal development coaching before, but that standard model wasn't really going to work for the scenario they needed something, a quick, short-term fix, but where 90 minutes probably wasn't going to be long enough to explore everything they wanted to explore. So that was the catalyst of us thinking, okay, how might we do this differently? And that's where the idea of this hypothesis came about to say, okay, so there's this standard model makes the assumption that you've got to have multiple sessions to make a difference in some sense. That the individual sessions are typically only about 90 minutes long, and most of the time they'll happen indoors. So it was about me thinking, okay, if you put all those things together and think differently, how could you do it so it would work? So what about if we did the coaching outside, because there's evidence that works from the previous research. People have talked about walking being a great way of doing coaching, and maybe that's a way of lengthening the session in a way where people aren't going to get mentally fatigued. Because one of my self-limiting beliefs at that point was, I'm sure for those of you who do a lot of coaching who are sitting out there today listening, is I don't know why this is jumping around today, sorry. after 2 hours sat in a room doing face-to-face coaching, for me, that's mentally tiring. So the thought of pushing that into 3 hours, 4 hours sat in a room just wasn't going to work. And so, that need to try and find and do it differently. So that's led me on to the last sort of 12, 18 months, really, and the latest part of the research that I've been doing into this as a creative process and how we structure it. And what essentially I've done is gone out to our existing client base and looked for sort of willing coachees to take part in the research. And these were the four things that they sort of had to fulfill, really, to take part. One, they had to have experienced that, what I've called standard coaching model before, of the, half a dozen sessions, probably over 6 months, and 4 to 6 weeks apart, probably 90 minutes each. So they'd had that experience to compare it to. They also had to have a significant issue that they wanted to resolve relatively quickly, that's something that they were stuck with. And then the third thing was that they had to be willing to invest, and this was probably the biggest challenge, in a minimum of half a day of their time to explore this issue. So it wasn't just going to be a couple of hours in their own office. They had to be willing to move away from the workplace. And then the final bit was then an interview about a month after the coaching about the experience of it. So not the content of what we discussed, but what their experience of walking and coaching for a longer duration was like in comparison to that standard model they'd experienced previously. So that's how this all came about. So what I'm going to share with you now then is how that developed and what some of the initial results are that are coming out of that, and some of the conclusions that we're starting to draw, and some of the feedback that we're getting from our clients who are using this, not with everybody, but for the people where it works. So just to give you some examples then, these are some of the places that I've found myself coaching in over the last 12 months. So top left there, you've got, that's Epping Forest, just outside London. Top right, that's a country park just outside Birmingham. The photo in the middle is Sherwood Forest up in Nottinghamshire. Bottom left is the Brecon Beacons. That's Pen y Fan, one of the highest peak in South Wales. And then finally, that's a rural canal down in Berkshire. Now, the interesting thing to point out with all of these sessions is none of these sessions lasted less than 3.5 hours. And in fact, where we were able to push it and the client had the time and the willingness, we were able to push it even further beyond that. So the example in the bottom left in the Brecon Beacons, we did a circular route from the car. So when we met in the car park, that session lasted for 6.5 hours. And that's the photo that I showed you at the start of the presentation. Now, other than 20 minutes for lunch and probably a bit of chat at the start to build a bit of rapport, we pretty much coached non-stop for about 5.5, 6 hours. And I have to say, from my own perspective, it was probably the easiest bit of coaching I've ever done in terms of lack of mental fatigue. I mean, at the end of that session, I could have easily started again and done it all over again. My legs probably wouldn't have let me, but mentally I was ready for it. And equally, that's what my coachee was reporting back as well, was saying, I've sat in a room before for 90 minutes and been exhausted mentally at the end of it. I can't believe we've just done that for 6 hours. It felt like it flew by in a couple of minutes. So those are some of the places we've been to in the last 12 months, and the sorts of durations we've been looking at. So between sort of 4 and 6 hours for a coaching session. So what I want to share with you now is some of the results that have come out of the interviews post-session as to both what my experience was as the coach, but also, more importantly, the experience of the coachees. So again, given that we're trying to be a bit more creative today, I got the felt tips out and I've done you a bit of a diagram as to the sort of blocks of evidence that have come out of these coaching encounters over the last 12 months or so. So I'll start at the top. I'll start with duration. So I think the interesting thing with the duration is that clearly in that standard model, over a period of time, people would commit sort of 12 plus hours of their time. And so what's been interesting in this scenario is, although in one session they're committing more time, overall it's less. And the interesting thing that's both surprised me and I would say almost all the coachees that reported back was they were amazed that, even within the sort of the 4-hour sessions that I had, they were able to get from start to finish in the issue that they wanted to resolve. Whereas in that standard model, they'd often felt that, I got part way through and then I had to go off and try and reflect on my own, which I'm not good at, and then come back to it 6 weeks later and so on. Whereas in that extended period, because it was run at a slower pace, we could explore better. It enabled them to reflect a bit better on the issue. And because that whole thing about, the involuntary attention, they just felt that they were able to think about the issue a bit more creatively, and it became, as mentioned before, a bit less stuck. And also that longer session allows that full resolution of the issue, so they can explore lots of different avenues, that some of which end up being dead ends. But it also allows more time to draw the links and connections between the different bits of the conversation. So by the time you're finishing the walk or that longer period, they're feeling like the issue has been maybe not completely resolved, but much further on than it would be in multiple short sessions. So that's the thing around duration. And I think there's just something about that, as I mentioned earlier on, the natural environment, allowing the sort of soft fascinations that don't bring that directed attention, that really seems to work for people. We'll take them clockwise then. So if I then look at the anchoring, so those that have done any NLP, neuro-linguistic program, will have come across the term anchoring before. So what's been really interesting in walking in a natural environment whilst coaching is that, as coaches, you're always, listening out for those aha moments that your coachee has when they have that breakthrough, new bit of thinking. And what's really useful whilst walking in a natural environment is when those moments happen, they're really, really obvious. In every single coaching example I did as part of the research, at some point somebody would stop dead in their tracks, stop speaking, look up into the sky or up into the trees and go, now that's it. And that physical stopping and was a real obvious thing for both them and me, that okay, this is the moment to hone in on. But importantly, there was also, in almost every case, a fantastic physical view, vista, resource, or something in front of us that we could then both pay attention to help them anchor that breakthrough. And I can think of a particular instance with one of the coachees who reported back probably 2 or 3 months later when I interviewed them, who said, I can play back the moment when I had that breakthrough with absolute detail. I can play the video in my head. I can feel the sensation, the positive emotion it gives me. And that's a fantastic resource to be able to draw back on, from that coaching session. And I'm not sure I would have got that if we'd have been sat in one of our meeting rooms down the corridor, because it was literally as we'd walked out into a clearing in a woodland, and at the time that they had this breakthrough thinking, and it really helped us to anchor that. So I think there's something really powerful in that it gives you much more opportunity to anchor some of those breakthrough bits of new thinking. Excuse me. So moving around again into well-being. I suppose this was the bit that shouldn't have surprised me, but did, as to how unexpected this was, the amount of well-being impact that the experience had. So all of them reported that even if you took the coaching out of it, they totally underestimated how much they needed that opportunity to press the pause button. Most of them were quite senior execs, and had realized that they probably weren't being that kind to themselves and had never really stopped and given them the permission, was probably the word, to step away from the business, take some time out, and invest in themselves, and noticing both the physical, mental, and emotional benefits they got of taking a block of time out during the working week, not in their own time, but during the working week, and feeling like they'd invested in themselves. And that was really, really interesting, that even without the coaching, it had that massive well-being effect for them, which for all of us that probably do a lot of our thinking, at the weekend, walking the dog or whatever, it's like, that's probably not surprising. But it's interesting that in the walking week, they all felt that it was a massive indulgence yeah, afterwards we're all reporting back, oh, that was absolutely what I needed to do. You know, feel so much more energized to go back and tackle this issue, and you know, with the coaching on top of it, helping me resolve it, feels the right thing to do. So I think that part of it can't be underestimated. Um, that also then ties into the bit, and I sort of alluded to this before when I was talking about the earlier research around attention restoration, in that what it really enabled, that involuntary attention and soft fascination that you get in a natural environment, totally allowed both me and the coachee in every encounter to really focus and hone in on the issue that they wanted to be more resolved. Um, there were no distractions, no people walking past. You know, they were able to properly dissociate from the workplace. So, you know, they weren't still in their head from the meeting they'd come from before, or they weren't thinking about the meeting they were about to go into. They properly dissociated, properly detached, and that ability to both give a really high level of attention and be in the moment of where they were really helped the coaching process um, move more rapidly through the issue they were trying to explore. Really, it's quite interesting. It's quite hard to capture in words, but there's something about yeah, that's that cliche, slowing down to speed up, isn't it? And there's definitely something about that in that walking environment that allows you to do that. The other thing that was a real surprise as well to me was I sort of had a self-limiting belief going into this research that I'm not going to be able to build a rapport with these people in a quick one-off session. You know, normally the rapport builds over these 6 sessions in the standard model, and that's probably not going to happen. What was interesting, and it was the polar opposite. So in almost all cases when I was doing the research, most of the people I'd never physically met before face to face. We'd exchanged emails, we might have had a phone call, but in most cases we met on the day that we did the coaching session for the first time. And interestingly, almost in every case, within 5 or 10 minutes, my sense and their sense in their report back in the interviews afterwards was that we had a much stronger rapport within a 10-minute, window than we would have got through an hour-long chemistry session, for example. And I think there's something about one, there's the things that they were reporting back were about, one, there was a speed of the process that, you know, you just get into it quickly because you're walking along and you probably walk into warm up and get going. So there's something about that. There was always something about being shoulder to shoulder as well. And again, can't put my finger on yet, but there's probably something from psychology around the fact that you're sharing the issue together and that the answer, neither of you hold the answer, but it's somewhere out in front of you along the physical journey that you're going to have. And then also going back to that point I mentioned before about people suggesting that the lack of eye contact because you're side by side would be a barrier. Actually, what several of the coaches reported back was that when they're in a room with someone being coached, they find the eye contact creates an additional pressure to answer quickly, that as a coachee, they feel like they need to be a good coachee. Whereas actually, whilst we were walking, they felt much more comfortable holding a silence. So obviously as coaches, you know, we become very good and capable at holding a silence because we know that's where the power is in the coaching. But for a lot of coachees, that's really uncomfortable. But what was interesting, what was whilst walking, coaches had said that they'd struggled with that in the past, said that was so easy. You asked a question and we could just walk for 10 minutes and I didn't feel the pressure to say anything to you in response. And that really helped that rapport build. And again, in most cases, it was really surprising how quickly we got right into the depth of the issue, into the personal depth of the issue, even though we'd never met before. It was really surprising to me how quickly that process happened. The next one then, space. So this was around just the physical space that you have. So, you know, things being reported back, like, you know, not feeling hemmed in by some of those meeting rooms I'm sure you've all got on your office blocks, you know, especially the ones that are like a goldfish bowl that are made out of glass walls where, you know, you're not sure how private it is and people are looking over the frosted bit to see who's in there and feeling a bit uncomfortable, or realizing that you can hear the conversation in the next room. So actually, can they hear what we're saying? So there's definitely something about being out in the open where, other than the odd dog walker that you might encounter, or you know that you're in a totally private and safe, it creates a really nice, safe psychological space. And And that was a big part of it for people. There was also something about, I don't know if any of you have done any work around constellations and sort of systemic coaching. There's a big process there about what's known as walking the field to which the system to which the problem belongs. And there's a real thing about, as you go, we're physically going on a journey, walking, but also the problem is revealing itself to us as we go through different stages of the journey. So it ties back into that thing I mentioned at the start about it being a much more of a somatic or embodied process. It also enables you to play with the resources in front of you. So again, going back to sort of constellations as a particular coaching tool, you can use the physical, natural resources in front of you, which I've done several times, to actually map out the coachee's issue in front of them, and use, whether that's leaves or rocks or twigs or whatever it might be, to physically map out the different representatives of the issue that they're trying to resolve. And that can be a really great embodied way of exploring and mapping a problem for them. And just that open vista, having an open vista in front of you, there's just something that allows a much more expansive way of thinking for people that they've reported back. So again, when they're having those aha moments, or they really want to sit and reflect about a question I've asked, it allows them to just stop and take in the view in front of them and think more broadly. You probably can't see on this picture, but just where the pen is, I've just scratched in pencil reflection, because one of the other really important things that came out from people right at the end was, because of the length of time that we had for the session, it allowed them much more opportunity to reflect within the coaching session. Because what typically has to happen in that standard model is that, because of the time pressure, there's lots of questions, there's lots of answers, and they feel under pressure to get something out of it as a coachee in the time they've got. And then there is space then before the next session to reflect. But if you're not a good reflector and you haven't got that tool in your toolbox yet, and you get sucked back into the day-to-day, the reflection doesn't often happen. So what was often been reporting back to me was, yeah, actually this is great because I can reflect on it in the moment. Or, towards the end of the session, they can say, well, can we just walk in silence for 15-20 minutes while I can reflect on where I've got to. But also, because they were totally detached from the workplace and they were then going to have to travel either back home in the car or back to work, there was also that reflective space while they're traveling back to wherever they were, to try and make sense of what they've just done, rather than what often happens at work, suddenly running into another important meeting or a stressful meeting, where all of that reflective space is taken away. Which again, I guess, ties into the intensity piece as well. So that, again, coming back to what I talked about earlier on about attention, and the fact that it enabled the process to be end to end, all in one go. And for a lot of these senior leaders who will say they're time poor, it was although it was a longer block of time, and it was difficult to carve that out, but I'm so glad I did, because I've done it all in one go. I got an end to end resolution, as it were. It was essentially that we covered greater amount of ground together, both physically and and metaphorically. But also that it was less intense, that physical proximity, that coming back to that shoulder to shoulder thing, for some coachees, they felt that much more comfortable than being in a room with somewhere where a couple of them said even though it's supposed to be a supportive environment, sometimes it feels a bit adversarial. So that intensity was definitely a big part of it. And then finally, going back to part of the, what I mentioned right in the video at the start about helping you to be more creative, both me as the coach, enabling me to think of, what tool might work here, and how could we use this bit of the environment to explore that issue. But there were no constraints. We didn't have four walls, we didn't have tables and chairs. We could stop and sit down when we wanted. We could walk, we could stand, we could use resources around us. That physical dissociation, that safe psychological space that it created, just really encourage them to hold on to those first thoughts and not edit, to sort of let go of their inner critic a bit more and be a bit kinder to themselves in relation to the thoughts that they were having, and be willing to explore those a bit further. And that high level of involuntary attention really, really encourages that. So that's a really rapid, I appreciate, run through of where I've got to in this research and what our clients that have gone through this process are reporting back. And so just to round off, I just wanted to draw a few conclusions on this. So I've captured on the left-hand side some of the things I've talked about there, about some of the positive outcomes and the reasons that you would do it. But I want to focus just at the end on, clearly there are some downsides to it as well. And, just to really reiterate, I'm not decrying the existing standard model. That model has worked for so many years and will continue to work for so many years more. And people do some amazing coaching in that model, and people get huge benefit out of it. However, it's one model, it's one structure, and there are so many others that we could explore. And so this idea for me of, especially for those senior leaders who are maybe you're noticing that they're getting a bit of that attention fatigue deficit, and they're looking mentally burnt out, and all the evidence is they're making bad decisions that they never used to make. They're not making time for their people anymore, and getting dragged into the day-to-day and then the minutiae and so on. If you're getting that sort of evidence and that they've got some big issue that they're trying to resolve, maybe this style of coaching might be a fantastic intervention for them. And compared to the standard model, definitely costs less money because it's only one intervention. They get a quicker resolution, and overall they spend less time doing it, even though it's more time in one block. But there are limitations. So clearly you're outside, so the weather is a factor. So a lot more planning comes into it. And again, as part of the contracting with your client, you've got to think about what will you feel comfortable with as the coach, but more importantly, what are they willing to put up with? So, if it's going to be too cold, is that okay? Making sure they're appropriately dressed. What happens if it rains? Are we still going to go ahead? Are they bothered with that? Are you bothered with that? All those things now come into play, which obviously they clearly wouldn't do if you were indoors. Again, if you're going to go walking on an A to B route or a circular route, you've got to be able to navigate. So what I've learned from painful experience through the research is, if the coachee comes up with the route and they know it inside out, fantastic, because they just walk on autopilot and navigating never gets in the way. But if they choose a venue where neither of you have been before, you as the coach have got to know where you're going, because otherwise when you come to a junction you need to know where you go. That can really break the flow of the conversation, and that often really gets in the way, and I've been very aware of that. So that's something that's come out of part of the research of things that don't work. Clear the terrain as well, whether you're choosing hills, the flat, forest, all that sort of thing. Does it get in the way of the flow of the conversation? So clearly, if your client, both your and your client's fitness, and you choose to climb up some massive hill or mountain and you're so exhausted you can't actually speak, then that's clearly going to get in the way of some effective coaching. Similarly, the ground underfoot, if the path's too narrow so you can't walk side by side, or you're constantly having to change paths because there's too much mud and things like that, that can break the flow of a nice coaching session. And that need to clearly contract with each other. There's other things that you've now got to take into account as a coach, because if when you're in a client's workspace, you're under all of their health and safety rules. They've done all the risk assessments around their building and everything else. If you're taking a client outside, even if it's a space they've chosen, you suddenly as a coach have a much greater duty of care to their health and well-being. So part of the contracting also needs to be having a conversation about their health, their fitness. Have they got any underlying injuries that you need to know about, things like that. So knee injuries, ankle injury, all those sorts of things suddenly become part of the contracting that wouldn't have done so before. And also then importantly, the terrain you're going in, you need to think about your own competence. So not just as a coach, but as someone who's taking another adult into an environment where they might not normally be at home. So suddenly it comes down to other areas of competence around leading people in outdoor environments. And that suddenly becomes really important, which for a lot of coaches wouldn't be something they would have ever thought of before. So that's a really important factor. And then finally, again, this last one, something that I encountered as part of my own experience, was where they get the resolution 2/3 of the way through the agreed time slot, but you've still got 1/3 of the walk still to go. So it's worth having that conversation beforehand of, So if that occurs, what are we going to do for the last part of the the walk? Are we just going to walk and chat? Are we going to walk in silence? Are we going to start with another issue, or what are we going to do? Because that can happen. So I'll leave it there for now in terms of where we want to get to, and in terms of how we're going to take this forward. I mean, that's been a real whistle-stop tour through this concept today. We're still continuing with the research. Well, I'm also now in the process of starting to look at people being willing to give me even more time. So to be coached, more retreat-like over a 48-hour period with an overnight, where there's an intensive session on the first day, a stay overnight somewhere where they can reflect and take it all in, and then a continuation the second day. So if any of you out there got any participants who you think might fit the bill, thinking of the things that I was looking for before, then do get in touch and let me know. And then also for coaches that are interested in exploring this as a tool that they might use in their own practice, there's clearly lots more things to take into account rather than we're just going to go out for a walk. So later in the year, we're going to advertise the idea of running a course where coaches can come together and share some of our experience and expertise and the research as how they can build that into their own coaching practice. I'm just going to go just looking through some of the chat questions. So I was aware there were some issues with the sound at the start, but hopefully that panned out. It's probably to do with people's connection speed. It's one of the very few questions, a small number of questions have come up here that I was totally expecting. Was, we all get it, we see that it's a benefit, but and I talked about it being an indulgence. How do you persuade senior people to buy into this time commitment? And I absolutely get that question, and it's one that I've come across before trying to get people to take part in the research. I think the approach I took with people was to say, almost to spin it the other way around, is what will happen if you don't do it? How much time will you end up committing to this over a longer period, probably not come up with the right solutions, get more burnt out? It's the thing, be kind to yourself. No one else is going to invest in you. You need to make this decision to take this. And I think one of the things that often gets in the way is, one, maybe their inner critic has too loud a voice, that actually they don't deserve the investment. That's often part of the psychology of it. But I think that's also strongly underpinned by the environment in which they're operating. So whether they feel safe to ask for that investment, and it's not so much the monetary investment, it's the time. And I think it's sort of me, playing back to them all. No one else is going to give you that time. If you can't choose to take that time, maybe that's saying something about how you're operating, that you need to do that. So totally accept it is difficult, but I think part of our job as suppliers of coaching, and as those of you that buy coaching or offer it as a resource to people, is helping get that message across that this is exactly what you need, and taking an afternoon out might give you so much more back for the next 2 or 3 months in terms of motivation, health and well-being, and encourage you to do other things. I mean, several of the coaches have reported back that they then took it further themselves and started doing much more walking and reflecting themselves to get some headspace that obviously doesn't cost anything. So I think, that is one of the biggest challenges. So I'm glad that several of you have raised that question, and I appreciate it's difficult, but I think it is one worth tackling head on, because the benefits really do seem to pay out. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to wrap up there. Those of you that wanted to share this with other people, we have recorded the webinar, so the webinar will be on our website in the interesting stuff section from Monday. So it'll be live from Monday. So if you just log onto our website on Monday, you'll be able to see the webinar, and then if you want to paste and share that with any peers, feel free to do that. I'd also ask as well, if you've enjoyed the webinar today, you'll automatically get an email out at the end with a link to a really short feedback questionnaire, loads of radio buttons. It'll be really quick, and then if you want to put any comments in, that'd be fantastic. Just either about the topic, whether you want to continue the conversation further, or any suggestions as to topics for future, webinars, or how you found them today. We'd really, really appreciate it. We definitely take it on board. And yeah, have a great rest of your Friday, and we'll look forward to talking to you on our next webinar. So take care. Bye now.